August 1945, Singapore. The war was over. But for hundreds of Japanese women left behind in the rubble of defeat, their nightmare was just beginning. What happened in the months that followed would challenge everything we think we know about enemies, forgiveness, and the true meaning of humanity. Before we dive into this extraordinary true story that history almost forgot, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and whether you've ever heard about the forgotten women of Singapore. The story I'm about to share with you isn't just another war tale. It's a revelation about the thin line between hatred and healing, about how one woman's quiet defiance transformed not just her own fate, but the hearts of those who came to judge her. This is a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice, mercy, and what it truly means to see the humanity in your enemy. Let me take you back to those chaotic days, when the Japanese occupation of Singapore crumbled under the weight of Allied victory. The city became a powder keg of rage, confusion, and desperate survival. Japanese soldiers fled into the jungle or threw down their weapons in surrender. But there was another group, almost invisible in the chaos. Hundreds of Japanese women, nurses, administrative workers, comfort station attendants, teachers, all suddenly abandoned by their retreating military, left to face a population that had suffered 3 brutal years under occupation. The local Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities remembered the massacres, the forced labor, the starvation. Their fury was biblical. British and Australian forces swept into the city, and among them was Sergeant William Barrett, a hardened veteran whose unit had liberated prisoner-of-war camps in Malaya just weeks before. What Barrett had seen in those camps, the skeletal bodies of his countrymen, the evidence of torture, the mass graves, had burned something dark and immovable into his soul. When orders came down to establish temporary holding camps for the remaining Japanese civilians, Barrett volunteered immediately, not out of compassion, out of rage. He wanted to look into the eyes of the people whose nation had committed such atrocities. He wanted them to feel even just a fraction of the fear and humiliation they had inflicted. The women were gathered hastily, rounded up from hospitals, administrative buildings, bombed-out barracks. They were terrified. Many had heard the yanks, rumors of reprisal killings sweeping through the city. They expected execution. Instead, they were herded into a commandeered school building on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. The British command was caught in a moral and logistical dilemma. These were enemy nationals, but they were also non-combatants, mostly civilians. International law was murky. Public sentiment demanded vengeance. But British military tradition, at least in theory, valued restraint. Into this seething cauldron walked Yuki Tanaka. She was 28 years old, a trained nurse from Kyoto who had been stationed at the Japanese military hospital in Singapore for 2 years. She walked with her back straight, her expression composed, her hands folded in front of her. While other women wept or cowered, Yuki moved through the camp with an almost serene dignity that infuriated Barrett the moment he saw her. To him, her composure looked like arrogance, like she didn't understand the gravity of what her people had done, like she felt no shame. The camp conditions were harsh, deliberately so. Rations were minimal. Medical supplies were non-existent. The barracks were overcrowded. Barrett made sure of it. He was not officially in charge, that was Captain Morrison, a by-the-book officer from Edinburgh, but Barrett ran the day-to-day operations with an iron fist. He made the morning roll calls deliberately humiliating, shouting orders in English that most women couldn't understand, mocking their bows, their formal apologies. He rationed water to the bare minimum. When one of the older women collapsed from heat exhaustion, he ordered her dragged to her bunk rather than calling for medical help. It was Yuki who intervened. She stepped forward from the line of women, speaking in careful, accented English. "Sergeant, please, this woman needs water and shade immediately, or she will die." Barrett turned on her, his face reddening. The entire yard went silent. "El Bondion did not speak to Barrett without being addressed first. One especially did not contradict him. "Get back in line," he growled. Yuki didn't move. Her voice remained calm, steady. "I am a nurse. I have treated hundreds of patients. This woman is in critical condition. If you will not help her, please allow me to do so." The tension in that moment was electric. You could hear nothing but the distant sounds of the city and the ragged breathing of the collapsed woman. The other Japanese women stared at the ground, terrified of what would happen next. Barrett took 3 steps toward Yuki, stopping just inches from her face. "You think you can give me orders? You think after what your people did, you have any right to ask for mercy? To ask for anything?" Yuki met his eyes. She didn't flinch. "I am not asking for mercy, Sergeant. I am asking for basic human decency. Something I hope still exists, even in war." Barrett's jaw clenched. For a moment it seemed he might strike her. Instead, he turned and bellowed at one of his men to bring water and move the woman to the shade. But as he walked away, he pointed back at Yuki. "You just made a very big mistake." Over the following days, Barrett made Yuki his personal target. He assigned her the worst tasks, cleaning the latrines, hauling refuse in the scorching heat. He denied her food at random intervals. He forced her to stand at attention for hours during inspections. He was trying to break her, trying to force her to show the fear, the shame, the deference he believed she owed. But Yuki endured it all with the same quiet dignity. She worked without complaint. She helped other women when they faltered. She never argued, never pleaded. And somehow that made Barrett even angrier. The other guards began to notice. Corporal Davies, a young soldier from Wales, quietly started leaving extra rations where Yuki could find them. Private Singh, a Sikh soldier whose family had suffered under Japanese occupation, found himself strangely moved by her composure. Even Captain Morrison pulled Barrett aside one evening, suggesting that perhaps his treatment of one particular prisoner was becoming problematic. But Barrett was unmoved. "She's playing you all," he snapped. "This is what they do. They act submissive, respectful, all while planning their next move. I've seen it before. Don't be fooled." Then came the incident that changed everything. 3 weeks into their detention, a tropical fever swept through the camp. It started with one woman, then spread rapidly through the overcrowded barracks. High fevers, violent shivering, delirium. The camp had no real medical facilities, and the British Medical Corps was overwhelmed with returning POWs and wounded soldiers. Captain Morrison requested supplies from headquarters, but they were slow in coming. By the 4th day, 2 women had died. Panic rippled through the camp. Barrett watched with grim satisfaction, seeing it as some kind of cosmic justice. But then the fever jumped to the guards. Private Singh went down first, then 2 others. Suddenly, this wasn't just about enemy prisoners suffering. This was a threat to British personnel. Captain Morrison made an emergency decision. He ordered that Yuki, who had medical training, be allowed to treat the sick, both Japanese and British, under guard supervision. Barrett exploded in protest, but Morrison overruled him. "We're losing men, Sergeant. Pride is a luxury we can't afford right now." Yuki was brought to the makeshift infirmary, a cleared classroom with mats on the floor. The scene was chaos, delirious patients, guards looking frightened and helpless, the stench of sickness heavy in the tropical air. Yuki surveyed the room with quick, assessing eyes, then began giving calm, clear instructions. Boil water, lots of it. Separate the patients by severity. Create airflow to reduce the temperature. Find any herbs, lemongrass, ginger, pandan leaves, anything that grows nearby. For the next 72 hours, Yuki barely slept. She moved from patient to patient with extraordinary skill and focus. She crafted cooling compresses from torn cloth and boiled water. She made herbal infusions from plants that local civilians brought to the fence. She monitored temperatures, adjusted treatment based on symptoms, held the hands of delirious patients regardless of their nationality. When Private Singh's fever spiked dangerously in the middle of the night, it was Yuki who stayed by his side, cooling his body, keeping him hydrated, whispering reassurances in broken English until the crisis passed. Barrett watched all of this from a distance, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He saw the respect growing in his men's eyes. He saw how the Japanese women looked at Yuki with something approaching reverence. And he hated it, because it complicated everything. It made her human, and he needed her to remain the enemy. By the end of the week, the fever had passed. All but one of the infected had survived. Far better odds than anyone had expected. Captain Morrison publicly thanked Yuki for her service, even shaking her hand, a gesture that sent shockwaves through both the British and Japanese populations of the camp. But Barrett's rage only deepened. Late one evening, as Yuki was returning to her barracks, Barrett intercepted her, his face twisted with emotion. "Don't think this changes anything," he hissed. "You saved a few lives. So what? Your people murdered thousands. They tortured my mates. They starved children. You don't get redemption for doing your job." Yuki stopped and turned to face him fully, and for the first time there was something different in her eyes. Not defiance, but a deep, profound sadness. "You are right, Sergeant," she said quietly. "I do not seek redemption. I know there is no redemption for what was done in this war. On all sides." She paused, her voice dropping even lower. "I worked in the military hospital here for 2 years. I saw the soldiers return from the front. I heard their stories. I treated their wounds. I also saw, Sergeant, what war does to the human soul. Barrett's fists clenched. Don't you dare compare. I am not comparing, Yuki interrupted, her voice still calm but now with an edge of steel. I am simply saying that I saw, just as you saw, and seeing has changed us both, hasn't it? You look at me and see only the enemy. You see your friends who died. Your rage is justified. But tell me, Sergeant, when you look in the mirror, do you see the man you were before the war? Or do you see only the anger? The silence that followed was crushing. Barrett stood there, his chest heaving, his hands shaking. He wanted to lash out, to put her back in her place. But her words had struck something deep. Something he'd been avoiding for months. He turned and walked away without another word. The next day, a group of local civilians, emboldened by rumors that the camp was vulnerable, gathered outside the fence. They shouted for justice. They demanded that the Japanese women be turned over to them for punishment. The crowd grew larger, angrier. Some threw stones. The British guards formed a line, but they were outnumbered. The situation was spiraling toward a massacre. Captain Morrison ordered the gates reinforced and sent for backup, but it would take time to arrive. Inside the camp, the Japanese women huddled together in terror, knowing exactly what fate awaited them if the fence was breached. Barrett stood at the gate, torn between his duty to maintain order and his own dark desire to simply walk away, to let justice, as he saw it, take its course. Then Yuki did something extraordinary. She walked calmly to the gate, approaching Barrett. "Let me speak to them," she said. Barrett looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "They'll tear you apart." "Perhaps," Yuki said. "But perhaps not. Perhaps if they see that we acknowledge their pain, their suffering, it will be enough." "This is insane," Barrett muttered. But something in her eyes, that same unshakable calm, that same inexplicable authority, made him hesitate. Against every instinct, he nodded to the guards to open the gate just enough for Yuki to step through. The crowd surged forward as Yuki walked out, alone, unarmed, into the space between the camp and the mob. The shouting intensified, but Yuki simply stood there, and then, slowly, deliberately, she bowed, a deep, formal bow. And she stayed down. The crowd's shouting began to falter. Confusion rippled through them. This was not the arrogant enemy they'd expected. This was something else. Yuki straightened and began to speak in Malay, which many in the crowd understood, her voice carrying across the tense space. "I am Yuki Tanaka. I was a nurse in the Japanese hospital. I know that nothing I say can erase the suffering that happened here. I know that my people, my nation, committed terrible acts in this city. I know that families were torn apart. That innocence died. That cruelty became commonplace." Her voice cracked slightly. "I am here to tell you that I saw it too. I treated the wounded, but I could not stop the evil. I lived in a system I could not control, and my silence was complicity. For that I am deeply ashamed. I do not ask for forgiveness. I only ask that you remember that justice and vengeance are not the same thing, and that the women behind this fence, many of them knew nothing of what happened outside the hospital walls. They are terrified. They are mothers, daughters, sisters, just as you are." The crowd was silent now, completely silent. Some faces still showed rage, but others were crying. Yuki continued, "If you need someone to answer for these crimes, then take me. I will go with you. But please, spare the others. They have already lost everything." Barrett, watching from the gate, felt something break inside him. This woman, this enemy, was offering her life for her people, just as he had once been willing to do for his. The parallel hit him like a physical blow. Before the crowd could respond, a voice rang out from behind them. "Stop! Everyone! Stop!" An older British officer, a colonel, was pushing through the crowd with a contingent of military police. "This camp is under British military authority. Any attempt to harm these prisoners will be treated as a crime against the crown. Disperse immediately." The crowd, faced with armed reinforcement, slowly began to break apart, though many cast hateful glances back at Yuki as they left. Yuki stood there, trembling now, her composure finally cracking as the adrenaline faded. Barrett walked out and, without a word, guided her back inside the gate. That night, as Yuki sat alone in the barracks, Barrett appeared in the doorway. The rage was gone from his face, replaced by something else. Exhaustion, confusion, maybe even respect. He stood there for a long moment before finally speaking. "Why did you do that? Why would you risk your life for them?" Yuki looked up at him. Because, Sergeant, someone had to break the cycle. Someone had to choose something other than fear or hatred. I do not expect you to understand. But I could not simply wait for violence to come. I had to try something else. Barrett stepped further into the room, his voice low. You said you saw what war does to the human soul. What did you mean? Yuki gestured for him to sit, and surprisingly, he did. What followed was a conversation that lasted deep into the night. Yuki told him about Kyoto before the war, about her training as a nurse, about her belief in healing and compassion. She told him about the day she was assigned to Singapore, how excited she had been to serve. And then she told him about what she witnessed. The wounded soldiers who cried for their mothers. The officers who drank themselves senseless to forget what they'd ordered. The day she was commanded to treat a soldier who had been beaten by his own officers for refusing to participate in an execution. The slow realization that she was part of a machine that devoured souls. I wanted to leave, she whispered. I begged to be sent home. But nurses were in short supply. So I stayed. And every day I told myself that at least I was saving lives, even if I could not stop the taking of lives. But it was not enough. It will never be enough. Barrett listened in silence, his throat tight. Finally he spoke. I lost my brother in a Japanese POW camp. Changi. He was a civilian, a teacher. They worked him to death building their damn railway. When we liberated the camp, I saw where he died. I saw the conditions. His voice broke. I came to this camp wanting to hurt you all, wanting you to feel what he felt. But you're right. Seeing changes you. And I don't know if I can carry this rage anymore. It's eating me alive. Yuki reached out slowly and placed her hand over his. A gesture so unexpected, so gentle that Barrett flinched. Then let it go, Sergeant, she said softly. Not for me. Not even for the women here. But for yourself. For your brother. He would not want you to become something dark in his name. That moment, that simple human connection between enemies, was the turning point. Not just for Barrett, but for the entire camp. In the weeks that followed, Barrett's transformation was visible to everyone. He began treating the women not as prisoners, but as human beings. He requisitioned better supplies. He allowed more freedom of movement. He even started learning basic Japanese phrases to communicate more effectively. The other guards followed his lead. What had been a place of tension and barely suppressed violence slowly became something else. Not friendship, not yet, but a tentative coexistence built on mutual recognition of shared humanity. Yuki continued to serve as the camp's unofficial medical officer, treating anyone who needed help. But she also began doing something else. In the evenings, she would sing old Japanese folk songs, melodies of home and peace. At first, only the Japanese women listened. But gradually the guards began to gather at a respectful distance. The music transcended language. It spoke of longing, of loss, of hope. Corporal Davies brought a harmonica one night and tentatively played along. Private Singh joined with a simple drum rhythm. Those impromptu concerts became a ritual, a nightly reminder that beauty could exist even in the aftermath of horror. Then came the revelation that no one expected. 6 months into the detention, a high-ranking British officer arrived at the camp for an inspection. Brigadier Charles Whitmore, a decorated veteran with a chest full of medals and a reputation for absolute integrity. He walked through the camp, nodding approvingly at the improvements Barrett had made. But when he saw Yuki, he stopped dead in his tracks. "My God," he whispered. "Nurse Tanaka?" Everyone froze. Yuki looked up, her eyes widening in recognition. "Brigadier Whitmore." The brigadier crossed the space quickly and, to the shock of everyone present, took Yuki's hands in his. "I thought you were dead. After Saigon I thought, how are you here?" Barrett stepped forward, confused and alarmed. "Sir, do you know this woman?" Brigadier Whitmore turned, his eyes bright. "Know her? Sergeant, this woman saved my life. 1942. I was part of an intelligence unit operating in French Indochina before the fall. We were betrayed, ambushed. I was shot twice and left for dead in the jungle. A local village took me in, but they had no medical supplies, no real way to help me. I was dying of infection." He looked back at Yuki. And then she appeared. She was on some kind of civilian medical mission, traveling between villages. She had medicine, real medicine. She stayed for 3 days, treating my wounds, fighting the fever. She never asked who I was or what side I was on. She just saved my life. And then she left before I could even properly thank her. The silence in the camp was absolute. Every eye was on Yuki. Barrett felt the ground shifting beneath him. All this time, all his assumptions, his rage, his certainty about who the enemy was, and here was proof that nothing was ever that simple. Yuki bowed to the brigadier. You were a patient. That is all. I did what any healer should do. That is not all, the brigadier said firmly. He turned to Captain Morrison and Barrett. This woman risked everything to save a British officer. If her superiors had known, she would have been executed for treason. She knew that. She saved me anyway. He looked around at the assembled guards and prisoners. Is this how we repay such courage? By keeping her in a camp? The revelation sent shockwaves not just through the camp but through the British command structure in Singapore. Questions were raised. How many other acts of quiet heroism had been forgotten in the fog of war? How many people had been caught between their duty and their conscience? The story reached the newspapers. Public opinion began to shift. The rage was still there, still justified, but now complicated by the recognition that war created impossible situations, and that humanity could persist even in the darkest places. Brigadier Whitmore personally advocated for the release of the Japanese women, arguing that continued detention served no purpose, and that many, like Yuki, deserved recognition rather than punishment. It was a slow process, mired in bureaucracy and politics, but eventually arrangements were made. The women would be allowed to return to Japan, with safe passage guaranteed. The day of their departure was emotional and complex. The Japanese women gathered their meager belongings, many of them crying, some from relief, others from the strange sadness of leaving a place where, against all odds, they had found moments of grace. The British guards, even those who had initially been hostile, lined up to see them off. There were awkward bows, hesitant handshakes, a few quiet words of goodbye. Barrett approached Yuki last. He stood before her, this woman who had challenged him, changed him, shown him that there was a path beyond hatred. He struggled for words. Finally, he simply said, "Thank you." Yuki smiled, a real smile that lit up her worn face. "For what, Sergeant?" "For not giving up on me. On us. For showing me that even in this hell, we could choose to be better." Yuki reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. She pressed it into his hand. "This is the address of my family's home in Kyoto. If you ever find yourself in Japan, if you ever need to know that the war truly ended, come visit. My mother makes excellent tea." She paused. "And Sergeant, please write to your brother's memory. Tell him that you found your way back to the man you were. He will rest easier knowing that." Barrett's eyes filled with tears, something he hadn't allowed himself in years. He nodded, unable to speak. As the trucks, carrying the women, pulled away, heading toward the port and the ships that would take them home, Barrett stood watching until they disappeared from view. In his hand, he clutched the paper with Yuki's address, and for the first time since the war began, he felt something other than rage or grief. He felt hope. The story of Yuki Tanaka and Sergeant William Barrett became one of the forgotten legends of Singapore's post-war period. It was overshadowed by the larger narratives of tribunals, reconstruction, and geopolitical maneuvering. But for those who witnessed it, for the guards and prisoners who lived through that transformation, it remained a testament to something essential about human nature. That we are capable of terrible evil, yes, but also of extraordinary grace. That hatred is a choice, and so is compassion. That seeing the humanity in our enemy is not weakness, but the highest form of courage. Years later, Barrett did travel to Kyoto. He found the address, knocked on the door of a modest traditional house. An elderly woman answered, Yuki's mother, and when he introduced himself, her face broke into a smile of recognition. Yuki had written about him. She welcomed him inside and over tea told him that Yuki had become a teacher, training young nurses in the principles of humanitarian care regardless of politics or nationality. She had married, had children, rebuilt her life. But she never forgot Singapore. She never forgot the choice to step beyond the fence and speak to the angry crowd. And she never forgot the British sergeant who chose to see her as a human being rather than just the enemy. As Barrett sat in that peaceful garden in Kyoto, sipping tea and watching cherry blossoms fall like snow, he understood that this was the true end of the war. Not the surrender documents or the tribunals, but this. Two people from opposite sides sitting together in peace, remembering not just the horror but the moments of grace that had emerged from it. The lesson of Yuki Tanaka's story resonates across decades. It reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when hatred seems justified and vengeance feels righteous, we have a choice. We can choose to see only the enemy, or we can choose to see the human being. We can choose to perpetuate cycles of violence and bitterness, or we can choose to be the one who breaks that cycle, even when it costs us everything. Yuki's courage was not in grand gestures or heroic battles. It was in quiet dignity, in consistent compassion, in refusing to let fear or hatred dictate her actions. And Barrett's redemption was not in forgetting what happened, or pretending the suffering wasn't real. It was in choosing to carry forward not just his grief, but also the lesson that Yuki taught him, that our shared humanity is stronger than our divisions. This story challenges us today. In a world still full of conflicts, prejudices, and easy categorizations of good and evil, it asks us, who are you choosing to see as fully human? What bridges are you refusing to cross because of old wounds or inherited hatreds? And most importantly, are you brave enough to be the one who steps through the gate, who speaks first, who offers the hand of reconciliation even when no one expects it? If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about enemies and forgiveness, about justice and mercy, then I ask you to do something. Share it. Comment below with your thoughts. Tell me about a time when someone's unexpected compassion changed your perspective. Hit that like button so more people can discover this forgotten chapter of history. And subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this. Stories of ordinary people making extraordinary choices in impossible situations. Stories that remind us that our better angels are always within reach if we're brave enough to listen to them. The women of Singapore taught us that redemption is possible, that grace can exist even in the aftermath of atrocity, and that the truest victory is not in defeating your enemy, but in transforming them into your teacher. Let's carry that lesson forward. Let's be the ones who choose compassion over vengeance, understanding over hatred, and common humanity over all the walls we build between us. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for choosing to be part of the solution rather than perpetuating the problems. Until next time, choose grace.